Welcome to Project Insight's Professional Development Series. Today's session is the last in our four-part series on navigating organizational growth. If you've not seen the others, they're accessible via the Project Insight website. In this session, dealing with resistance to change, we're focusing on one of the biggest barriers to organizational success, resistance. We'll talk about why all projects involve risks and how to mitigate it, what causes positive change efforts to stall or backtrack, and why it's essential to consistently re-emphasize the why behind change strategy. You'll leave with tools to help guide your organization through uncertainty and towards lasting success. A few housekeeping notes. Today's all participants will be on mute. Please feel free to use the chat if you have any questions. This is good for one PDU, but you must stay until the end of the webinar to be able to receive that credit. The PDU will be mailed before the week is done, and this session will be accessible right here on the Project Insight website for future use. Let me introduce our experts. Steve West is the founder and CEO of Project Insight. For the last 2 decades, he's helped centralize project work across expanding teams and tools to streamline workflows, automate processes, and allow our customers to make accurate, data-driven decisions. Diane Buckley-Alwies is the CEO of Core Performance Concepts. She's a seasoned project management expert throughout multiple industries, an author, a speaker, volunteer, consultant. As always, we're so lucky to be learning from you too. You guys ready to get going?
Yep.
I think so.
Wonderful.
I don't know. I'm going to resist that.
You're going to resist it? No.
I'm going to resist that. No, I don't want to do this.
Then at the end, we'll circle back and come around, all the way, and I can say, how can we better, get Diane where we need her to be? So.
Right. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody, and hi Steve and hi Matt. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Awesome. Well, we're going to start with just kind of the why behind resistance. I mean, every project we work on, every venture we embark on has risks associated to it, and people don't necessarily gravitate toward accepting risk naturally. And, one of the things that we have to think about is, and why it's important to address risk and address resistance from the very beginning, is because if we stick our head in the sand and we don't pay attention to it up front, the cost of change will significantly increase. Mm-hmm. So there's always going to be risk and uncertainty at the beginning of a project. And, we're putting our plans together, but if you always are thinking of, looking through the lens of a rose-colored glasses, you're going to get surprised later on, right? So expect the resistance, plan for those kinds of changes. And the more we can plan for that up front, the better we'll be off in the long run. So one of the things that we have to think about, and I'm going to bring in the sessions that we've done, the prior sessions, because this is the 4th of our 4-part series about, dealing with change. And in our last session, we talked a lot about motivation. And in that session, we talked that we can't truly motivate people. We can help them become more motivated, but we can't motivate them. Different from motivation, risk attitude is something that you can change. People naturally have an attitude toward risk, but they also respond to the organization's that's a bad word, organization's attitude toward risk. So there's 3 terms that we'll talk about is, risk appetite is how much are you willing to take on, and how much are you willing to withstand is your tolerance. And then there's a threshold when you basically say, I've had enough. So the interesting thing and difference between risk attitude and motivation is the risk attitude, we can manage and we can set expectations. And there's ways and strategies to do that. And it will differ at the project level, at the person level, at the client level, at the department level, at the organizational level. So we have to think about it through a lot of different lenses to be able to make sure that we're putting the appropriate plans in place.
Yeah. All of those different stakeholders have different attitudes toward it, right? And different feelings on where it is. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the risk that I deal with in like financial services is going to be very different than maybe the risk that somebody deals with in medical or in a brewery or things like that. So the organization will change too. And what is that situation? And I think Steve, you and I were talking about even from client to client, like we might be implementing the same technology, and you're going to have a very different conversation with those clients from client to
Definitely. I mean, there's some organizations, they're worried about how something is gonna roll out, and others are just let's go for it, right?
right. And so if I have a client that's like, let's go for it, they are probably going to be more likely to accept when things change later on than the client that says, oh, we have to dot every I and cross every T, and I need to make sure my boss is knowledgeable about this and they've approved it, and that our compliance team has, so there's all kinds of other factors that affect how we individually look at risk.
Oh yeah.
And then there's the word of conflict, right? But we have to remember that there's positive conflict and there's negative conflict. So you've got risks are going to happen. Attitudes are going to be different, very different. And they're going to have people that are willing to deal with conflict or not deal with conflict. And there's aspects of good conflict and bad conflict. So in a perfect scenario, when we're talking about resistance, is you want to assess early on, who are your stakeholders? We do this with our stakeholder analysis, right? Who are our stakeholders? What are their attitudes towards risk? How do they deal with conflict, and how do you manage through that conflict? We want to encourage the positive conflicts that happen naturally as part of your project, but we want to manage the negative conflict. And that can be best managed if you understand where people's attitude is with regard to their risks. So remember in the last session, we talked about the Simon Sinek, the concept of why, right? Explaining to people why we're doing what we're doing, and not necessarily just what we're doing. One of the things that I see some challenges with is we get our projects and then we just go. We just start moving, and we don't take the time to really set the stage, explain the situation, even as simple as what is the problem we're trying to solve. Getting people on the same page, like what is the problem we're trying to solve, and make sure everybody understands that. And sometimes if you narrow down the conversation to the problem you're trying to solve, so let's say we want to reduce duplicate data entry, and that's where we're going. So we want to reduce that as the primary goal. If you can spend time, pretty much every time you have a conversation, talk about the reasons that we're moving forward, that can really reduce that amount of conflict that's happening, because people tend to say, like, all this can go wrong. I'm like, okay, fine, you can go down every single path, but what are we actually trying to do? So keeping people calm and keeping people focused on the goals helps us manage through a lot of that conflict and a lot of those attitudes.
Yeah, and I think people that are risk averse are usually really loud about it too. So if you're going to do a project and someone's kind of against it, there's oftentimes they're maybe more vocal than the supporters.
Yeah,
really disrupt your project.
Yeah, I've worked in a couple organizations and a couple nonprofit organizations where you have some longstanding people there, and it's like,
right,
their first answer is no, we're not doing it that way.
Or why are we doing? Like sometimes they'll say, "Why are we doing this?" I have no idea why we're doing it. That's a red flag for you as a PM to say, "Well, let's go back to the basics here."
Yeah, right. And you know what? It might be boring to 3/4 of the group, but it's not going to be boring to those couple resistors.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get a successful project if you don't address the resistors. and get them on board in some way, shape, or form. They might not be the ones jumping up and down, kudos on everything, but they're the ones that could actually significantly negatively impact your project. So remember, we also talked about that law of diffusion, where focus on the ones that are the people that are proponents of your project, but you can't forget the detractors. You still have to work through them. And that's where a lot of that resistance comes in. If you have too much resistance, you're going to end up with delayed projects, higher costs, frustrated team members, frustrated clients, all that kind of plays together. So it really is important to start from the very beginning and understand who they are and plan for that conflict, plan for that ongoing communication about the why.
Right. And I'm the kind of person that's like, I'll tell the why out real quick and expect everyone to just get it right away in the first time. So
and
this is a good reminder for me to go back and be like, hey, does everybody, sometimes, we talked earlier in some of these communications, you'll say, does everybody get it? And everyone's quiet.
Mm-hmm.
So is that a positive, or is everyone just in their mind and no one wants to be the one that says, hey, maybe you should think about X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, and I've heard that's a great point, Steve. And I've heard project managers say, "Well, I'm going to take silence as a yes. We're good."
Yeah, right.
And it's not necessarily the best way to do it. So, you might have some people that are vocal within your project meetings, but it might be a reason to reach out to those that are not so vocal one-on-one.
Well, it helps if you know who is that way up front, but that's not always a luxury you have as a PM, especially if you're just putting a team together that you don't know them.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to tell right out in the beginning.
Yeah, and a lot of times, we talk about change and change management. A lot of times the project manager is coming in and you're getting new team members and you don't have that relationship. And that relationship is critical in ensuring success. And I know, one of the perfect segue into the next slide here is that you have to allow, and sometimes we feel like it's too slow, but you have to allow for those questions. You have to allow for people to understand those benefits, even if it sounds like you're saying it 10 times. Because how many of us are guilty of not paying attention on a meeting or a webinar, right?
What, Diane? What was that? What'd you say? Yeah.
We're all guilty of it at some point in time, no matter how hard we try. All of a sudden, the beep on the phone comes. I mean, when I'm on the webinar, I turn it off, but the beep on the phone, you look here, and then it's like, oh, shoot, I just missed the last minute of the conversation. So it can be totally unintentional, and we need to make sure that people are understanding. So being repetitive is truly, truly important. And you start building trust. The challenge here is that it's very hard to build that trust and very easy to lose it. So once, and this gives you some examples here on the screen, is, a leadership change, the head business analyst, moves on to a new job and now you have somebody else new in that position, or the CEO leaves and that CEO had your project as one of the top projects. So, oh my God, that might be a significant change. But how you interact with people, it's super important to continue to always stay positive, continue to repeat yourself, and make sure you're talking about those benefits. But if you lie or you don't, and maybe, or fib, I'll say fib. I'll say fib, then you're going to lose trust. I mean, even every day, there's times when you don't want to tell your customer everything that's going on, right? Because that's your own dirty laundry, what's going on behind the curtain. But you also don't want to lie to people, and you want to be honest with them, and you want to be able to share with them maybe your challenges that are going on, but you have to really carefully word your words, right?
Yeah, even over promising and under delivering here, right? It's the same idea where it's not an out and out, this is not the truth, but it still has that same, effect where it's one step forward and five back in that instance, and on this scale. So
right, and you can look at it from the perspective of the client of over promising, or maybe you're committing somebody to something that you really shouldn't be committing them to. It could be your own person in your own team. Oh, Mary can get that done for you by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and you haven't even asked her. So now Mary's going to be upset with you. Again, that trust, one of the key things with regard to not having resistance is to have the trust with your team members and your clients and all your stakeholders.
Right. And I think, talking about that trust, it's a two-way, like sometimes you'd want the resistance, meaning, and a real good example, there's a special on the Space Shuttle Challenger, which happened when I was a kid. And I remember watching it where there was an engineer who knew they shouldn't launch that space shuttle that day because of the temperature. He was very worried about it, but the powers that be kind of weren't listening to the risk. So, on one hand, you want to alleviate risk, but also that trust of them, your people telling you when there is a problem, you need to know so that you don't have something, especially if your project's obviously a space shuttle launch is one of the highest risk things you can do. Compared to like software deployments are not that high a risk. I mean, because generally doesn't, unless it's for medical software, things like that.
Yeah.
Well, that engineer, I say I don't know, that, whoever that person was that was kind of trying to wave the red flags, think of where they hit on this continuum, right? They went back 5 because their leaders, the people in power, didn't have any faith in what they were saying. And boom, now that, are they even going to say anything next time or wait until the documentary kind of thing, So that's the trick.
And again, I mean, the point here is that so much can happen. And, you hate to be the negative Nelly, but I don't want to I don't like to say that way, because we have to be open to other people's perspectives, and we do have to listen. And then we have to make educated decisions based on the data we have. And if people aren't talking, if people aren't providing input, then we're going to make decisions on things incorrectly. So you got to foster that environment of trust throughout the project, starting from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think, going back to that example I was saying, where if you're having a Zoom meeting and you're going over the project plan and you're saying these are the risks, these are the goals, this is what we're doing, and you get the silence, a tip might be to invite anyone to reach out to you one-on-one after the call.
Sure.
To try to get that information from your team. And that actually will help you with the trust as well, because they'll feel like, okay, maybe I don't have to say it in front of everybody because they're not sure. Offering that extra channel can help.
Yeah, and there have been many times in my career that I've had people come up to me, one-on-one and say, this person, I'm really having a hard time with this person. So then I'm communicating with them for whatever reason. So we sit and we'll chat about it, and we'll kind of, figure out a strategy on how to best get your message across so that they can listen to you and actually take corrective action. To get everything back aligned, and that's what, this slide talks about is the project manager. You're a lot of things, right?
Yeah, right.
And you're a lot of things. And
you're a superhero, right?
That's right. We're all superheroes, right? Got to get our cape on. And one day you're starting a project, you're the initiator, you're starting, and everybody's going to have things that they really enjoy doing. But regardless, our job is to ensure success. So we have to put these hats on all the time, and know when we have to switch hats. So if you're starting to sense resistance, even though you might have planned well for it, you might start seeing some resistance. That person that says, no, we shouldn't do it that way, or we've always done it this way, so why are we changing? You have to take the time to work through those individuals, to get them to understand and to at least be amenable to the plan that's in place. So the communicator is the superpower that really affects your ability to address resistance.
Yeah, it's like the spidey sense,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Risk sense.
Well, to your point, it's like you could think silence is great, but to me, my ears would perk up. And I'm like, okay, well, silence isn't always great. And I got to go figure out what's going on, but not necessarily call people out in the meeting.
Right, exactly.
I think that's a really, Steve mentioned, giving people the opportunity to sync up at a different point in time. We had a kind of a change meeting recently, and that was offered. And I know people internally engaged in that because it is nice to not have to air all of your laundry in front of everyone, right? To have that secondary channel of communication. So
yeah, and it could just be as simple as changing a process within your organization. I'm talking to a group right now, and we're going from kind of more of a sprint process to more of a Kanban process, and you could say there's some resistance, but there's a lot of questions, and that's okay. I want the questions, because if they don't ask the questions now, we'll go down a path.
Yeah.
And then we won't be able to course correct, at all, because the person is being quiet. So I, even though that might put you on the spot to answer a lot of questions, having a lot of questions means that, what, this is a little bit more complicated than I thought it was. So we have to kind of spend some time and really think through it and make sure that everybody's on board. So speaking of communication, there are the 5 C's of communication, and correctness, conciseness, clarity, coherent, and control. So every communication we have, we should be ensuring that we are following this kind of philosophy. I mean, I know that if I get an email with a lot of spelling or grammar errors, I may lose respect for that person or may just delete it. I'm not talking to this person because they can't even speak English, right? But maybe it's somebody that's like brand new to speaking English, so maybe I should be a little bit more accommodating. But for me, I'm English. I'm American, so I should make sure that my grammar, my spelling, because that it sets an impression to those that are receiving it, and also the clarity. One of my pet peeves is people being not verbose enough or too verbose in their communication. And what
well,
go ahead.
And this is where maybe ChatGPT can help you, or Copilot, because you can rough out your message and say, can check. I mean, I don't recommend writing your emails with a bot, but you can certainly have the grammar and the clarity and you can offer suggestions these days. It makes you faster.
Yeah, or if you tend to be there's 2 different or 3 3 different types of people. Those that are very curt and very short, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So you can use ChatGPT and say, here's the context. Give me, this is what I want to say. Make it better for me.
Right.
Or
make it better is the prompt.
Right.
Or make it more concise if you tend to have run-on paragraphs.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right. I do love how ChatGPT makes a lot of bullet kind of points.
Yep.
And I think that's great, because that keeps things simple and people can read through bullets.
Yeah, but make sure you reread what they send back to you, because it's not perfect yet.
So. No. They might spell organization the wrong way. Yeah.
You've got the British bot as far as that's concerned.
That's right.
And it's a little different. Yeah.
That's right. But, the coherency is also important. Like, does it logically flow? Can people follow it? I think as a project manager, your writing skills are probably the most important skills, because you're constantly out there talking to, your stakeholders. B, you're constantly, talking to your team. And if you're being confusing, they're
Yeah.
going to be confused.
Well, it's
Oh,
so much now with texting and messaging and email. So much communication is written form.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the past, you might have more meetings in person and do a lot, when I say in the past, 20, 30 years ago, because as we go to our devices more and more, so much of what you're doing is in a written form. And that's not easy to be clear. We all know that the misread text or the misread message, that can happen. But having really solid grammar and English and control of writing is important, I think, for PMs.
Right. And think about from a resistance standpoint, if you're overly verbose and people don't really read what you say, then are they really on board with what you're trying to do? If that's the perception you're giving people, right? So those are the things that you have to be consciously aware of, and making sure that what you're communicating is clear, concise, coherent, and people are acknowledging that.
Yeah, and under communicating is bad, and over communicating is bad. Because if you're sending too many notes, too long, everyone's busy these days, especially your stakeholders. They may not read it; it becomes noise. So be mindful of that. Also, we always talk about using features like meeting minutes in our tool to help you log these communications and keep them. Don't just Teams it and then have it vanish in the 5 days later from your messaging app and you can't find it again. It's good to keep this information organized with your project plan.
Even at that though, it's still keep that coherent. That's one of the ones that sometimes on meeting minutes I'm taking almost like a stenographer style kind of notes on this and this, and then it's important to go in and give that recap at the end, so that way it's clear for anybody who does need to go back and not have the play by play. They can just say, oh, this is exactly what it was, right?
So. And that I've seen the chat, that the bots and stuff really be helpful there. Even though the conversation might have gone various different ways, it's actually pretty decent at kind of bringing it back to the 3 or 4 main points or next steps that you have in the meeting. So it is pretty interesting to see how that technology and that capability does help us in ensuring.
Well, it certainly makes it easier to accomplish, because I can recall just 10 years ago, it can be very time consuming to redo the recap. But if you can use the tech now to kind of help speed that up. And again, I always recommend make sure you read what it did come up with, because it's too easy to just paste in and it's wrong. That's not going to be positive for
anyone
for these communication rules.
Agree. Well, let's go on to the next topic here a little bit. And we mentioned it earlier about reinforcing the why. The Simon Sinek TED Talk, just can't think here. TED Talk is amazing. If you hadn't had a chance to take a look at that, that's, you should, if you weren't in the last session. And then also, so that TED Talk talks about the importance of why. And if you can relate to your stakeholders and your team members by talking about the why more than the how and the what, you'll see improvement in resistance. And the other concept to think about is the size of your project, whether it's a one person, one other person, or it's 10 other people, that those number of communication channels, grow exponentially. So if I have 2 people on my team, I got 1 connection. So that's easy. So Steve and I, we can be working side by side. We can be remote. But it's just the 2 of us, right? So we're going to be way more efficient than we have a team of 15. So this goes to how many times you have to repeat things, right? If I have 15 people on my team, or I'll do it first. If I have 4 people on my team, the communication channels is now 6. So I went from 1 channel to 6 channels. And if I have 15 people on my team using this formula, I have over 105 channels of communication. So you don't think 15 people is a lot of people for a team size. It seems like a relatively normal size team. That's 105 communication channels that you have to make sure are in sync. So when you think about why resistance happens, think about all those communication channels and all the potential breakdowns in communication that can happen. And if you, to your point, Steve, say, this is why we're doing it, and you never say it again, all the, maybe one person, two people got it, and the rest are on a different planet. They're thinking something else. They're not understanding what you said was the goal. And so they're going down a path which, either they're going to resist, or they're just going to do something different that's going to be detrimental to the project.
Yeah, and of course everybody, it's the telephone game going on there too, right? The old infamous, you say one thing and then in the background you can lose control of the narrative, because if you're not doing that, then your team will be talking amongst each other, and next thing you know, you've got a faction of people that think something totally different than what the real goals are.
Yeah, and you have to balance. I mean, none of us want more meetings. I mean, we probably all have plenty of meetings, right? But it's always good to start with, and this is all best practices in meeting management. Start with your agenda. Have an agenda. Start with why we're having this conversation, and if you, versus get on the phone, 15 people are on the phone and you just start talking about things without any organization or structure, you're going to lose people. You're going to cause resistance, so these are techniques for you to ensure that you manage any potential resistance coming down the pike.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that project managers do a lot of things. The other skill that I think is super important for project managers in managing any kind of resistance is being a good influencer. And a lot of this stuff all overlaps. And influencing to me is not getting people to do things the way you want them to do it, right? That's not it. It's more about getting people aligned with a vision, right? I want to influence people, and I want to get people to understand where we're going and be supportive of that direction. So the way that I do that, or the way that we do that as people and project manager, is not tell people you must go here, right? Mm-hmm. You have to build those networks. This goes back to that trust. You have to, cooperate with others. They got to want to listen to you, right? And that means you have to listen to them. There was a time that I met with a gentleman and I was just doing some networking, and it sounded like there would be a good connection. We met at some networking event and we had a 5-10 minute conversation. I said, okay, well, let's get together. And we met for coffee for an hour, and he didn't ask me one question. Yeah. Not one. He just talked about all the things that he was doing and why he was doing them and all that. Okay, great. But you're not influencing me and getting me to get behind you, because you're not even listening to me.
Well, you're never going to learn anything unless you're asking them questions.
Right. So we don't want to be the only person talking in the meeting, right?
Yeah.
We want to build commonality. That's why we're understanding people's interests and where they are, and and you don't have to be best buddies, but you got to present yourself as being interested in them.
Yeah. And plus, I think if you're talking, then you're going to be doing the work too much. At some point, it's a form of delegation, is allowing the others to be Agreed. Leaders in your team.
Agreed. And there's nothing wrong with giving people those opportunities.
Yeah.
To be a leader in their group, and not circumvent it. So that's another part where you talk about that trust and stuff. If you've got to listen to people, you got to build their networks, you got to support them, and work with them to build them up. And then one of the other things on here that I think is super important for project managers and from an influencing standpoint is nobody wins if the project never ends, right?
Mm-hmm.
So being able to get people on board to saying that we're closing this project. I don't know about people in the webinar. Have you ever gotten to the point where you can't get your client to say it's good because they just keep bringing stuff up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can close it out and start the next phase, new project.
Right, and that's again, that's why are they resisting closing? Why are they not willing to say that it's good enough or it's met the requirements? All those things. When you talk about resistance, trying to get people to get on the same page and move in a direction together is what we're talking about when we talk about trying to eliminate the resistance. So conflict obviously is inevitable. No matter how much I like you, Matt and Steve, probably things we don't agree on.
Sure.
But and the reason we don't agree might have nothing to do with the project itself. It could be the situation that one of us is in right now, and we're dealing with other things, and I don't have time to work with this right now, and so there could be competing objectives. There could be, I could have misunderstood somebody. Like you might have said the objective of the project 3 weeks ago, and I didn't remember that, so I'm thinking it's something else. So there's so much that can cause conflict, and it's important to understand that it is inevitable, and we have to plan for it. When I started the session here, you can't stick your head in the sand at all. Your job is to make sure that we keep our head out of the sand and we do everything we can to help move the project along.
And help others on your team not do the same.
Agreed.
The whole team has to have their head not in the sand.
Agreed. I mean, how many people have had a difficult person on their project team or on their client team?
Oh, of course.
Right?
Anyone who's worked projects or
I've
clients,
probably been the difficult person at some point or another.
Yeah, there have been moments when I've had to be the difficult person.
Yeah.
There's time you might have to be a difficult person, but you got to understand why that person's being difficult.
Yeah.
And even you can still resist them, but also explain why and try to influence them.
Well, and also, like you said earlier, listen to what is it that they feel like they're validated.
Right. Agreed. So there's going to be conflict. So this chart here gives you some ideas and things to think about, to look at. Recognize when the conflict is happening. Get your head out of the sand, right? Figure out what those sources are. Like you said, it's like, why is that person being so difficult?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is it that they're concerned about? And a lot of times their intent has good intentions.
Right.
It's just the way that they're communicating. Sometimes we all get defensive. We've all been defensive at times. Somebody says something the wrong way, and it's like, your hair on the back of your neck raises. But you have to figure out what that source is. And so that's, we have to let it roll off of our backs a lot of times and kind of just try to figure out why they're being difficult. And then, do we jump on every single difficult situation? Probably no. You got to think about how's it impacting your project, and should I address it or not?
Right.
And then how do you engage when you see the conflict happening? How do you get somebody to understand how they're impacting the team or the project? So, there's all kinds of things that you can practice on, and lots of books out there on how to engage with people when conflict exists. And, trust ends up becoming the most important thing.
Yeah. And everyone's style is a little different too, because my tendency is to deal with it right away and call somebody up and ask what's going on. But, that may not be the right approach for that individual, what your tendency is.
True. And again, and of course everything can backfire too. You just never know, right? But it comes down to getting the individual to trust you that your intentions are good. So even if you come at them and it might not be the best approach, you're going to, hopefully you're paying attention and you get some inkling that, oops, maybe that wasn't right. Let's time out, let's kind of move forward in a different angle. But once you lose trust, it's really hard to get it back. And I know I said that many times. So our goal here is to pay attention to when resistance is happening, figure out why it's happening, address why it's happening, and hopefully build that trust up or build it up again so that you're all moving down on in the same path. And again, trying to move from negative conflict to positive conflict more often. It comes down to communication. You can have, positive conflict that turns negative, and you can have negative conflict that turns positive with the right facilitator. So we really do have to worry about our communication. And if you see people communicating poorly within your team, you should address it, because that communication is so critical. On the term of communication, again, how much information? You mentioned it, Steve. Sometimes it's way too much information. Sometimes it's not enough information. So understand all your stakeholders, understand, how they want to be communicated, how they impact your, the power they have over your project, and how much interest they have in your project. So this grid is always helpful to kind of think about, all right, so if I've got somebody that is a significant stakeholder in my project, but they have a little interest, they're the ones that are going to inherit the new project management software, but they're just not the person that really worries about software, but that's their department, that department. So they have high power over that, but maybe some low interest. So you don't want to bombard them with lots and lots of information about the details of the project. You want to highlight the things that are important to them, right? So give them some personal attention and try to help, get them aligned with your project. So knowing those stakeholders is also important. So we're dealing with conflict, we're dealing with stakeholders, we're dealing with communication, we're dealing with influencing skills. So it's a lot of things that we got to do. And then it all comes down to my objectives. So we started these 4 sessions talking about how KPIs and objectives are important in success of projects. And especially when you're starting to see some resistance, if you're tracking and monitoring the progress of your project over the course of the project, it significantly helps in deterring any resistance. The naysayer out there, oh, we shouldn't change. But if you're monitoring it on a regular basis, if you're constantly talking about it, if you're constantly showing progress, positive progress, you can significantly reduce the resistance on your project.
Definitely. And as you build that success, that's where that original chart that you had in the very beginning. That's why over time people start to believe, because they can see the results.
Yeah, and it ends up being a snowball, right?
Right. Yeah.
So there's no magic pill to affecting resistance, but it's all the skills that we all have learned. Anybody, you've gone through your PMBOK, right? Conflict management, influencing skills, change management skills, communication skills, all of these things. But you have to do it, plan for it early. Don't put your head in the sand, and constantly be assessing where everybody is, and constantly be measuring your progress over time. And then if that's the case, you're going to start seeing that resistance fade, and you get more and more people really aligned with what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So that brings us to a close. Any questions?
Feel free to use the chat if you do have any. This will be accessible here on the website as is the same location where you can catch up on the last 3 that we had in this series, or any of the ones that we've done previously at that point. And you can get your phones out for the QR code as we wait to see if there are any questions. Again, a reminder on this that the PDU will be sent to you before the end of the week, but you must go ahead and fill that out on your way. While that's just remaining up there, I could talk about some upcoming webinars that we do have coming up. Steve and I are going to be hosting our Power Tutorial series, which is 15 minutes, kind of hands-on on new features or ways in which you can interact with Project Insight. This is a really exciting one. It's an enhancement to our program and portfolio level views, where you can manage all tasks on the task tree. So you'll be able to look at everything all in one shot. And we'll look forward to seeing you then on next week, the 21st of May. Then join us, the trio, back in June, on June 11th, for leading projects through pivots, budget cuts, and uncertainty, which I think everybody can relate to what's happening right now, right? Just kind of globally speaking, there's a lot of that. So how can you still make sure you have successful outcomes with your project and your work? We'll go over some ways that can happen on the 11th of June. And then our Project Insights Where Your Cape to Work podcast, season 2, will be launching in the near future. With that in mind, feel free to catch up on the last season's episode, season 1, on the podcast place of your choice. Buzzsprout is where they are hosted, and you can keep that phone out to scan that QR code for that as well. So it's June 3rd. Thank you so much that season 2 will be launched, and we look forward to seeing everybody then. Thank you so much for joining us today. Steve, Diane, as always, thank you for all of the wonderful insight that you've provided, and we really appreciate it.
We'll see you next month.
Thanks, Diane.
Thanks, everybody.